Now you just listen, and I mean what I say and not a word more. If you want to hiss, hiss when I finish. Hiss on Mr. Liebler's time. You had to be given a panacea. You had to be given something which you could swallow. So one lone nut did it, and there is no motivation. And the media of this country cooperated and sold it to you, and there was no criticism. And so we bought it. The American people bought it. But now the facts are out, and we don't buy it anymore. And now we say to Lyndon Johnson, or at least I say to Lyndon Johnson, let the American people know what happened that day in Dallas. Let us know who killed your predecessor. We loved him, and we want to know why he died, and how he died, and who did it. And Mr. Johnson, if you do not give us that information, we will remember that in 1968 when it's our chance to speak.
On January the 25th, 1967, at UCLA in California, two men squared off to debate a topic that was becoming an increasingly hot one in late 1960s America. Who killed President Kennedy? Had there or had there not been a conspiracy behind his murder? One of the debaters at UCLA was Mark Lane, the godfather of Kennedy conspiracy theory. The other debater was Wesley Liebler, who had worked as a junior counsel for the Warren Commission and had since become one of the Warren Report's sharpest public defenders. Mark Lane and Wesley Liebler seriously hated each other. 3 months earlier, in October 1966, Lane had come to UCLA to give his standard conspiratorial lecture about the Kennedy assassination, and Liebler had interjected from the floor that day and had challenged Lane to debate him on the issue there and then.
Mr. Lane issued a press conference this morning in which he challenges Commissioners Ford and Dulles to a public debate on the issues involved in the Warren Report and the investigation that the Warren Commission conducted. I was surprised, in view of the issuance of that press conference, that Mr. Lane wasn't willing to meet me in a public debate in the other room, but perhaps we can have that now.
Well,
up to this time, there is one.
If I can comment now,
I'm not
be a question.
But I'm not through. I'm not through.
Mr. Liebler, I'll comment on that aspect of it, and you or anyone else can ask any other question you want, but I'm not going to sit here and listen to this without being given an opportunity to respond. I was invited here to speak. I'm going to accept the courtesy which has been offered to me by the student body, and I'm going to speak.
Checking the debate.
On the question of debate. Now let's go into that. On the question of debate. For almost 3 years, I've traveled up and down this country. I was here before at UCLA. I've been at 85 other college campuses. Where were the commission lawyers?
We're here now, Mr. Lane.
Just hold on.
We're
right
here
here.
now.
I'm right here. Mr. Liebler,
You declined my invitation to
let's
debate.
play a game called courtesy. You be quiet when I speak, and I'll be quiet when you speak.
Lane had dodged Wesley Liebler's debate challenge on that day in October 1966, but now in January 1967, their debate was finally going to happen. So why should we talk about this debate now? 1967 was a long time ago, and both the men who took part in this debate are now dead. Wesley Liebler died in a light plane crash in 2002, and Mark Lane died in 2016 at the age of 89, proving that only the good die young. So why talk now about a debate that these two dead men had 57 years ago? Well, I'm going to argue in this episode that there's a line that leads from that debating hall at UCLA in 1967 to the politics of today and the dangerous conspiratorial style of Donald Trump. This line isn't a straight line. It's taken some twists and turns along the way. But any story that ends with the phrase President Donald Trump is bound to be a pretty twisted story. As a non-American, I want to understand what the hell's happening in America right now. I want to understand how a country that was once the world's most intelligent democracy, a place where some truths were held to be self-evident, has now become a place where a cartoon character like Donald Trump can get elected president not just once, but, as I speak, seems to be on the brink of getting elected president again. I'm recording this podcast a week before the 2024 presidential election, and maybe Trump won't win that election. But even if he doesn't, the fact that he's even in the race and the fact that the race is close is absurd, and it cries out to be explained. In this episode, I want to try to understand this collapse into absurdity. I want to understand how conspiracy theory in America came out of the margins and the shadows where it belongs and exploded into the political mainstream. Obviously, I think that Kennedy conspiracy theory has got a lot to do with this. I think it was a disaster for the American mind when the idea of a JFK conspiracy established itself as a mainstream belief, a baked-in myth that more than half the population has believed in for more than half a century. And when you look back and try to work out how and when this myth became so entrenched in the American mind, you find that 1967 was a key year for Kennedy conspiracy theory. In 1966, the first of the big best-selling conspiratorial books had been published, Edward Epstein's Inquest and Mark Lane's Rush to Judgment. In 1967, a second rash of conspiratorial books appeared, including Josiah Thompson's 6 Seconds in Dallas and Sylvia Maher's Accessories After the Fact. 1967 was also the year when Jim Garrison launched his ridiculous but eye-catching assassination probe in New Orleans. Kennedy conspiracy theory really took fire in 1967. But why was that? It certainly wasn't because the conspiracy theorists had come any closer to proving their case objectively. They'd had 3 years to do that and they still hadn't succeeded. And that really should have meant that their movement was on the way out. Instead, it was thriving. The reason for that had nothing to do with the merits of the conspiratorial books and everything to do with unrelated events that were happening out in the wider culture. In 1967, the Vietnam War was becoming increasingly unpopular in America. Year by year, the annual number of US casualties in Vietnam kept growing. That figure would reach a peak the following year in 1968. Everybody by now was talking about the Johnson administration's credibility gap, the gap between the lies that the administration was telling about Vietnam and what was really happening there. And Kennedy conspiracy theory was making the most of this atmosphere of doubt and confusion and suspicion. Conspiracy theory is cunning like this. It can't prove its case by fair means, but it can win people over by latching on to trends in the wider culture. The American counterculture was really taking off in 1967. Anti-government sentiment was on the rise, especially on the university campuses. So when Mark Lane rolled into UCLA to peddle his radical anti-establishment views about the Kennedy assassination, he was bound to get a rousing reception. In fact, he'd more or less won his debate with Wesley Liebler before either of them stepped up onto the stage. But that victory had nothing to do with the intrinsic merits of Lane's arguments and everything to do with his skills as a cynical Trump-like demagogue who had no regard whatsoever for the truth and for common decency. My name is David Free, and this is The Ghosts of Dallas. We're going to talk about the Lane versus Liebler debate in a moment, but since I want this episode of the podcast to be at least as much about the present as it is about the past, I want to start by talking about something from the here and now, and then we're going to work our way back from today to 1967. The thing I want to talk about from the here and now is a comment that I saw in the comments section on YouTube under one of the early episodes of this podcast. It was a 2-word comment, and it said, "lefty nonsense." Now, the word nonsense doesn't particularly bother me there. Obviously, it's the verdict of a cretin, but it's the kind of cretinous verdict that you would expect when you do a podcast like this. The word lefty, though, did surprise me, because I'm not a lefty, and I don't aspire to be one, and I don't think that anyone who's listened to more than 5 minutes of this podcast would think that I am one. This is a podcast about the conspiracy theories of both the right and the left, and I'd say I've been far more critical in this podcast of left-wing conspiracy theory than I have been of right-wing conspiracy theory. After all, Kennedy conspiracy theory started off as a left-wing phenomenon, as I explained in the early episodes of the podcast. I've also spent a fair bit of time in this podcast, although perhaps not enough time, putting the boot into the left-wing hacks in today's universities who celebrate and encourage conspiracy theory instead of condemning it, partly because they view conspiracy theory as a cry of anguish from marginalised communities, and partly because they don't have the intellectual backbone to admit that some things are true and some things are false, and that believing true things is better than believing false things. So why, after all of that, would anybody think that I'm a lefty? I assume that it's because, as well as criticising the left in this podcast, I've also put the boot into Donald Trump, who I think is by far the most dangerous conspiracy theorist currently operating in America. And of course, for a certain kind of listener, any criticism of Trump is a deal breaker. These people tend to tune out of the podcast about 5 minutes into episode 1, although some of them are generous enough to put their thoughts about those first 5 minutes of the podcast into words and into the form of a 1-star review. Given that the guy who called me a lefty is almost certainly no longer listening to the podcast, it's probably too late now for me to try to explain to him that the things I think are wrong with Trump have got nothing to do with the normal left versus right disagreements that happen in a functioning democracy. I should have tried to make this much clearer back in episode 1, when the Trump fans were still listening, but here's what I would say to that guy who called me a lefty, if he was still listening. I'd say to him, I don't dislike Donald Trump because I'm a fan of the American Democratic Party or of Kamala Harris. As you may have detected from my accent, I'm not an American and I won't be getting a vote next Tuesday. But as a non-American, I will have to live with the consequences of what happens in that election because America is still the world's most powerful and influential democracy. And when the world's most important democracy elects a president who is simply a terrible human being, a man who is uncivilized and antisocial and dangerously unstable and unpredictable and unreliable, that isn't just America's problem, it becomes everybody else's problem too, including mine. That's why I'm against Trump, not on narrow political grounds, but on human grounds, because he's so obviously beyond the pale as a human being that I find it staggering that some people can't see that, or worse still, can see it but choose to ignore it for their own narrow political reasons. We could quibble forever about whether Trump meets the technical definition of being a fascist or a psychopath, but nobody can tell me that he doesn't meet the technical definition of being a complete dick. He's a bad man, and the trouble with bad men is that they do bad things. Of course, I don't claim to be saying anything very new or radical when I say that Donald Trump is a ridiculous person who goes beyond the pale of normal left versus right democratic politics. If I do have something new to say about Trump, it's about Trump and conspiracy theory. I think that the way Trump goes beyond left and right and beyond the pale of normal politics is analogous to the way that conspiracy theory goes beyond the pale of rational discourse. And I think that the way the truth is ceasing to matter in the Trump era echoes the way that the truth about the Kennedy assassination ceased to be audible in the late 1960s. To me, Donald Trump belongs in exactly the same category as people like Mark Lane and Jim Garrison and Oliver Stone. Those people, of course, thought that they were being very left-wing when they went around claiming that Kennedy had been murdered by a vast military-industrial government conspiracy. But as I pointed out in my episodes about Garrison, there's nothing very left-wing about preferring your own private fantasies to the truth and persecuting innocent people in an effort to turn those fantasies into reality. I'd say that you can't be a true progressive unless you accept that there is such a thing as the real world that exists, whether you like what's in it or not. And I'd also say that you can't be a true conservative unless you accept that. Conspiracy theory is simply a regressive form of belief. It doesn't matter whether you call yourself a left-winger or a right-winger. When you sign up to conspiracy theory, you're signing up to a fantasy-based belief system that's going to take you down a black hole, first intellectually and then morally. As I say, we can argue forever about whether Trump technically qualifies as a fascist, but he certainly qualifies as a conspiracy theorist. And in this episode, I'm going to show that the methods Trump has used to spread his conspiracy theories are exactly the same as the methods that people like Vladimir Putin and Adolf Hitler have used to spread their conspiracy theories. Obviously, it would be an exaggeration to say that Trump belongs in the same moral ballpark as those two men, but he's certainly in the same intellectual ballpark, and that's a ballpark that you really shouldn't want to be in. The fact that so many people don't seem to care that Trump is in that ballpark suggests to me that they don't know how serious history and reality can be. They remind me of something that George Orwell said about communist sympathisers in the 1930s. Orwell said, "So much of left-wing thought is a kind of playing with fire by people who don't even know that fire is hot." When Trump pushes his conspiracy theories about stolen elections, he's playing with fire, and he's too dumb and illiterate to know it, and he's too self-absorbed to know how hot the fires of reality can be. And if America keeps rewarding Trump for behaving like this, then America is playing with fire too. So how does all of this tie in with the story of Kennedy conspiracism? Well, let's go back to 1967 and start looking at that debate between Mark Lane and Wesley Liebler.
The format is as follows. There will be opening statements, starting with Mr. Lane, of 12 minutes each, rebuttal of 9 minutes, further rebuttal of 6 minutes, and finally closing statements of 4 minutes each. I intend to enforce the ground rules rigorously.
Mark Lane had already turned himself into a scarily good demagogue by the time that he turned up to debate Wesley Liebler in January 1967. Lane had been delivering public lectures about Lee Harvey Oswald's supposed innocence since early 1964, even before the Warren Report was published. By 1967, Lane was a master of using misdirection and other rhetorical tricks to deceive his audiences into thinking that he had a case. As I've said before, Lane was in one respect not a typical conspiracy theorist. Most of the early Kennedy conspiracists were honestly confused or mistaken or deluded about what had happened in Dallas. But Mark Lane was none of those things. He knew full well that the conspiratorial case he was making was bogus. Lane was a trained defence lawyer, as well as a chronically dishonest man, and in his public lectures he was making the same kinds of bogus moves that defence lawyers always make when they're defending clients who are guilty. Lane was using exactly the same tricks that he would have used in a courtroom if Oswald had ever been brought to trial. The most charitable interpretation of Lane's behaviour is that he had convinced himself that Oswald was entitled to receive some kind of public defence, even if you had to systematically dodge and conceal the truth to make that defence. A less charitable reading of Lane's behaviour is that he was entirely out for himself. He'd realised that by lying about the Kennedy assassination, he could sell a lot of books and make a lot of money and turn himself into an American folk hero.
Mr. Lane?
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. It has been said in the press that 3 years ago I embarked upon a lonely crusade, and I stood almost alone in this country with some doubts about the official version of what happened in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. I never was alone, never for one instant, although the media, radio, television, newspapers almost unanimously endorsed the Commission's report and served as salesmen to the American people. Although the government very clearly took its position, I never was alone, because I spoke at some 85 college campuses throughout this country. And I discovered then that which I really knew before, and that is that you said that you loved him. You said that you loved the things for which he lived. And unlike the vast majority of the American people and almost the media unanimously, you did not show a callous disregard for the manner in which he died. And so I'm happy to be back here again today.
Those opening remarks from Lane give us a good taste of his two-faced style. He's pretending to reject the press narrative that he's some kind of heroic lone gunslinger who's been pursuing the truth about Kennedy's murder all by himself, but at the same time as he's supposedly rejecting that narrative, he's going out of his way to repeat it, in case anybody in the room hasn't heard it yet. Then Lane suggests that the reason why he's not a lone hero is that all the good skeptical students of UCLA believe the same thing that he does. And finally, as a capper, Lane makes the ridiculous suggestion that anyone who doesn't believe there was a conspiracy behind Kennedy's murder is demonstrating a callous disregard for the manner in which he died. The way Lane bizarrely frames it, if you don't believe in a conspiracy, then you don't care about the fact that Kennedy was murdered. When Wesley Liebler got up to make his opening remarks, he did his best to counter some of the illegitimate moves that Lane had just made. Liebler began by trying to make it clear to the students in the room that he wasn't there to defend or represent the American establishment. Just because he accepted the fact that Oswald had killed Kennedy, that didn't mean he was somehow a right-winger or that he supported the Johnson administration's policies in Vietnam. In fact, he didn't support those policies. And the idea that the Warren Report had any connection at all with Vietnam or with any other current political event simply wasn't logical. And Liebler did his best to make that point clear.
It has been difficult to make a considered judgment of the wave of criticism of the Warren Report which has been sweeping the country. Very few people have either the time or the abiding interest to delve into the report and the 26 volumes of evidence on which it is based. But that must be done. It is not possible to judge the conclusions of the report on the basis of the critical literature alone. Before going to specifics, I want to make clear my own personal views on a number of points. I think that much of the receptiveness to criticism of the report is part of a much more widespread lack of faith in government. We do not know what to believe when we hear that we are attempting in good faith to negotiate a settlement in Vietnam, or that the governor means no harm to the University of California. The Warren Report is a convenient object against which we can direct the frustrations that we all rightly feel as a result of the so-called credibility gap.
As Liebler says there, the American people were well within their rights to think that the Johnson administration had developed a credibility gap with respect to Vietnam. But it was wrong-headed to think that this credibility gap could somehow be stretched backwards 3 years into the past to 1964, so that it covered the Warren Report as well. It wasn't as if President Johnson had had any hands-on role in the composition and creation of the Warren Report. Johnson had simply commissioned the report and taken delivery of it. You can hear that Liebler was reading his remarks about the credibility gap off a piece of paper. He'd obviously prepared this part of his presentation in advance because he knew that he would be starting the debate that day on the back foot, and that before he could even begin to rebut any of the specific lies that Lane told on the stage that day, he would first have to try and clear away the general fog of misconceptions that had set in around the topic of Kennedy's murder. The idea that the Warren Report had something to do with the Vietnam War, for example, was a giant red herring that had to be dealt with before any sane discussion of the real issues could begin. In his opening remarks, Liebler did his best to take the red herring of Vietnam off the table, and then Mark Lane simply stood back up and put that red herring right back on the table.
Mr. Lane, you have 9 minutes for rebuttal.
I have found a statement by Mr. Liebler at long last with which I am in agreement. There is a credibility gap in this country. It is because your government lies to you that there is a credibility gap. There's nothing wrong with us in doubting that which has been told to us about Vietnam or about the Warren Commission report. The trouble is in the statements that are being made. They're not accurate, so we can't believe them. And that's what causes the gap. And that's why it would be a good thing to get some of the facts instead of relying upon the faith that is invested in the Chief Justice, because of his good works in many other areas.
Lane's argument was completely circular there. Without offering any proof at all, he just flatly repeated his claim that the government had lied about the Kennedy assassination in exactly the same way that it was currently lying about Vietnam. In both cases, Lane said, it was the government's fault that the public didn't believe it, because in both cases the statements the government had made were not accurate. That claim was true about Vietnam, but it wasn't true about the Warren Report. If the Warren Report did contain any significant incorrect statements, that hadn't yet been proved, and it was up to the people like Lane to prove it. In fact, that is what he was supposed to be doing right now in this debate. He was supposed to be saying exactly what was wrong with the Warren Report and exactly what all these incorrect statements that had been made in it were. But instead of doing that, Lane was making some seriously inaccurate statements of his own. Take, for example, his statement that, quote, it would be a good thing to get some of the facts about the assassination instead of relying on the faith that is invested in Earl Warren because of his good works in other areas. It's hard to overstate just how outrageous and absurd it was of Lane to say this. He was talking as if the Warren Report and the 26 volumes of supporting evidence that had been published along with it didn't contain any facts. He was talking as if the Commission, in that vast shelf load of books, had not presented any evidence at all to make its case and had spent 27 volumes basically just saying, we think Oswald is guilty, but we don't know of any facts which prove that, so you're just going to have to take our word for it because Earl Warren is a decent guy. Anyone who had so much as glanced at any of the volumes published by the Warren Commission would have known that Lane's claim was absolutely ridiculous and that those volumes were full to the brim with evidence of Oswald's guilt. Lane, though, seemed to be gambling on the hope that most people in the room wouldn't have glanced at those volumes. He was talking as if the Warren Commission's enormous investigative effort could now be brushed aside and erased from history. He was talking as if the search for facts about the assassination had to begin now, from scratch, and that it really was high time that somebody started to investigate the complete mystery of Kennedy's death. Lane was talking as if the ball was still in the government's court, when in fact it was in his own court, or rather it was behind his own court. It was lying against the back fence behind his court, because the Warren Commission had hit a screaming winner past Lane back in 1964, and Lane hadn't even been able to get the frame of his racket on it. Lane's way of dealing with this problem was simply to pretend that the winner had never been hit. The ball had never left the other court. This was a common move among the early conspiracy theorists. The claim that the Warren Report was just a giant, empty fairy tale which contained no evidence at all was the conspiracy theorists' version of the big lie. And the sinister thing was that by 1967, this big lie was undoubtedly working. A good chunk of the American public was under the impression now that the case against Oswald had never really been made, and that it was incumbent on people like Wesley Liebler to stand up and make that case all over again. Something very strange had happened to the burden of proof in the Kennedy case. In reality, the Warren Commission had discharged its burden of proof against Oswald spectacularly, and if people like Lane wanted to defend Oswald, the burden of proof now lay heavily on them. But in the fog of confusion that surrounded the case, people were starting to forget this point. They seemed to think that the lone assassin story was subject to some kind of eternal burden of proof. It wasn't enough that the Warren Commission had rolled the rock of truth all the way to the top of the hill once. Somehow it had to go on doing that forever. Really, the Warren Commission's problem wasn't so much a proof problem as a public relations problem. There was no lack of proof in the Warren Report. The problem was that the proof hadn't landed with the public. It hadn't sunk in, partly because people like Lane had worked so hard to make sure that it wouldn't sink in. And that was a worry, because if the case against Oswald hadn't sunk in when the Warren Commission made it, it was probably never going to sink in, because nobody ever again was going to be able to make that case more thoroughly than the Warren Commission had already made it. So what did Mark Lane say next in that debate at UCLA, after saying that it would be a good thing if the facts about the assassination could now be established? Did he start to offer some new facts of his own? Of course he didn't. Did he mention any specific claim made by the Warren Commission that had turned out not to be a fact? Again, of course he didn't. Instead of talking about what was in the report, Lane very quickly pivoted to the question of what wasn't in it.
Now, all the 26 volumes have been published, and that's the test of the Commission's case, Mr. Liebler states. Fine. Photographs and x-rays aren't there because of respect for the Kennedy family. Did the Commission ever ask to examine the photographs and the x-rays? Never. Is it out of respect for the Kennedy family that the Commission members themselves would not look at the x-rays and the photographs? I hardly think that can be the reason. But that's not all that's missing from the record. That's a very small portion of the suppressed evidence. How about the Zapruder films? Why are there frames missing there, which have not been published by the Commission? And when the Commission did get around to publishing them, 313 is the one which shows the effect of the bullet striking the president in the head, the fatal shot. Why did the Commission then publish the two most important frames in terms of determining the direction of the president's head movement, two succeeding frames, 314 and 315, in a reverse way, calling 315 314 and 314 315? Just a mistake, said J. Edgar Hoover in a letter that he wrote to a student at UCLA who called this error to his attention. Just an error.
A critic of Mark Lane's said once that while great lawyers have an instinct to go for the jugular, Lane had an instinct to go for the capillaries. Lane's problem, of course, in the Kennedy case was that there was no jugular to go for if you insisted on believing that Oswald was innocent. Oswald was the jugular in the Kennedy case, so Lane really had no choice but to go for the capillaries. He had to turn away from all the fantastically damaging information about Oswald that was in the Warren Report, and he had to talk about the possibly helpful information that was not in the report. For example, the Warren Commission had published the official autopsy report along with a handwritten draft of the autopsy report and some autopsy sketches. And those materials were more than enough to establish that Kennedy had been shot twice, and twice only, from behind. But instead of talking about those materials that were in the report, Lane wanted to talk about what the Commission hadn't published, namely the autopsy x-rays and photographs. Lane made it sound as if he was making a killer point here, but in fact he was engaging in another piece of misdirection. If the photographs and x-rays had been published, they would only have backed up what the official autopsy report already said, and Lane would then have suddenly lost interest in them, or else he would have started alleging that they too were fraudulent, in the same way that he'd already alleged that the autopsy report was fraudulent. Similarly, Lane didn't want to talk about the 159 frames of the Zapruder film that the Warren Commission had published. He only wanted to talk about the fact that 2 frames in that 159 frame sequence had been printed in reverse order, and that 4 frames were missing from the sequence altogether. Conspiracy theorists always say that they're just asking questions, and what could possibly be wrong with just asking questions? And if you wanted to be superficial, you could say that that's all Mark Lane was doing in that clip we just listened to. He was just asking questions. But most of the questions he was asking had already been answered, and answered accurately, which meant that asking these questions again was simply a way of refusing to accept the truth. In fact, Lane himself admitted twice in that clip I just played that the questions he was asking had already been answered. He admitted that J. Edgar Hoover had already explained why frames 314 and 315 had appeared in the report in reverse order. It was because of a printing error. Even though this answer had come from J. Edgar Hoover, it was in fact true, and no better or more true answer was ever going to materialise. But of course this true answer didn't satisfy Mark Lane, because in the paranoid world of his conspiracy theories, human error was no longer a thing. Accidents never happen in the world of conspiracy theory. Only the most sinister interpretation will do. But if you insist on looking for alternative answers after the true answer has been delivered, the answers you come up with are bound by definition to be false. The same thing applies to another question Lane asked in that clip. The question of why the Warren Commission had not used the autopsy photographs in its deliberations. Again, Lane admitted that an official answer to this question had already been provided. Earl Warren had refused to admit the autopsy photographs into evidence out of respect for the Kennedy family. But again, this answer wouldn't do for Lane. "I hardly think that can be the answer," he said. But again, the answer that Lane refused to accept was in fact true. Earl Warren had decided, after taking one look at the autopsy photographs, that he didn't want them to become part of the official record. "They were so horrible that I could not sleep well for nights," Warren recalled in his memoirs. Warren knew that if the Commission put the autopsy photographs into the official record, they would eventually get into the hands of the sensationalists, and he didn't want that to happen. So he unilaterally decided that the Commission was not going to use the photographs. Other members of the Commission passionately disagreed with that decision, and in the long run, it did turn out to be a terrible mistake, but that was what had happened, and Warren had acted out of a sense of human decency. Again, this explanation was unacceptable in Lane's universe, because in the world of conspiracy theory, human decency isn't a thing either, just as human error isn't a thing. But again, this explanation was the truth, whether you liked it or not, and if you insisted on looking for an alternative explanation, then whatever alternative explanation you dreamed up could only be false. Another thing to notice about the questions that Lane was asking in that clip is the breakneck speed that he was asking them at. People who want to have a rational conversation, a conversation that might lead to some genuine answers, tend to speak at a slow and relaxed pace. But in his debate with Wesley Liebler, Mark Lane seemed to be deliberately exceeding that rational speed limit. He was talking faster than the speed of thought. The clip I just played was 1 minute long, and in the space of that minute, Lane sprayed out 5 different questions. Each of those questions had a perfectly reasonable answer, and in each case, the reasonable answer supported Liebler's side of the argument, not Lane's. The trouble for Liebler, though, was that those reasonable answers could not feasibly be provided in the 9 minutes that he had to reply. In 9 minutes, there was just no way that Liebler could answer all of the rapid-fire, scattershot questions that Lane had sprayed out in his 9 minutes. The answers to these questions were all very complicated, and they couldn't be reduced to simple sound bites. Again, Lane just didn't really want to hear the answers to the questions he was asking, because if he had, he would have asked just 1 or 2 questions and given time for Liebler to either answer them adequately or else fail to answer them. Conspiracy theorists don't ask their incessant questions because they really want to learn anything, or indeed because there's anything they think they don't already know. Their questions are a weapon. They're a tactic for spreading unreasonable doubt. As I've said many times in this podcast, conspiracy theory is always looking to drag the rest of us sideways into the weeds. It's always looking to stop us from moving forward and arriving at a destination that it desperately doesn't want us to arrive at, namely the truth. Wesley Liebler made a very perceptive remark about Mark Lane's style after he'd debated him a few times. Liebler said, "There's an old legend about frogs jumping from the mouth of a perfidious man every time he speaks. These frogs, representing the lies, leap out, and you have to run in all directions to grab them. It's just incredible to listen to him. If he talks for 5 minutes, it takes an hour to straighten out the record." I like Liebler's metaphor, but I think that his numbers were a little bit conservative. In the clip I just played, Mark Lane only spoke for 1 minute, not 5, and it would have taken far more than an hour to chase down all of the frogs that he unleashed in that minute. In Liebler's metaphor, the frogs leaping out of Lane's mouth were lies, and you could technically say that nothing that came out of Lane's mouth in that clip I just played was a lie, because all he did in that clip was ask questions. And how can a question be a lie? But a question can be a lie if you ask it without really wanting to know the answer, and if your only reason for asking it is to drag a conversation sideways or backwards instead of moving it forwards. When Mark Lane did this, he was using a tactic that's used quite commonly by dishonest debaters. The tactic is known as the Gish Gallop, and it's named after the late American creationist Duane Gish. That's Gish. Back in the 1990s, when there was a big craze for staging live debates between creationists and evolutionary scientists, Duane Gish routinely used to turn up to represent the creationist side. By rights, Gish should have lost every last one of the debates that he participated in, because his opponents had scientific fact on their side and Gish didn't. But to get around that handicap, Gish used to frustrate his opponents by spewing out his bogus arguments at a torrential pace, like a fire hose or a galloping horse, hence the term Gish Gallop. Gish's arguments were all bad in the sense that they could all be rationally debunked if you had the time, but of course in a debate the time you have is strictly limited. Gish exploited that fact by spewing out far too many bad points in his allotted time than his opponents could feasibly debunk in their allotted time. When Gish got up on a debating stage, his aim wasn't to get at the truth. His aim was to stop the audience from being allowed to hear and absorb the truth. Any debate with Gish in it was unlikely to send the audience away in a state of enlightenment. It was likelier to send them away in a state of confusion. And when you're as wrong about the facts as Gish was, confusing your audience is the closest thing to a victory that you're ever going to get. This is why a lot of evolutionary scientists, like Richard Dawkins, eventually gave up debating creationists like Gish. As Dawkins put it, they've won the moment you agree to have a debate. They won't win the argument, but it makes it look like there really is an argument to be had. I had planned to play some audio of Duane Gish using his famous Gish-Gallop technique, but when I went looking for some good clips of Gish using the technique, I frankly couldn't find any clip that better illustrated the technique than the clip I just played of Mark Lane. Mark Lane was a master of the Gish-Gallop before it even had a name. So let's stick then with Mark Lane's use of the technique, and let's zero in on just one of the pseudo questions that he put to Wesley Liebler during that minute-long Gish-Gallop at UCLA.
But that's not all that's missing from the record. That's a very small portion of the suppressed evidence. How about the Zapruder films? We talked about frame 312 and 313. That's part of a longer film made by Abraham Zapruder. Why are there frames missing there, which have not been published by the Commission?
Notice the cocky and cynical tone Lane asks that question in. It doesn't sound like the tone of a man who's asking a question or who's going to accept a reasonable answer if that answer is given to him. It sounds more like the tone of a man who already knows everything there is to know. His tone suggests that there can't possibly be an innocent reason why the missing frames had not appeared in the Warren report. Whatever the reason for their absence was, it had to be sinister. This cocky tone of Lane's was, of course, a bluff. If he knew that the frames were missing for some sinister reason, he would have explained that reason to the audience instead of just dropping dark hints about it. Again, Lane was using a bad faith debating tactic. His cynical tone was telling the audience, even if Liebler stands up right now and gives us an answer to this question, we needn't bother listening to him because any answer that he gives us is bound to be just one more lie. So what were these missing Zapruder frames that Lane was talking about? Well, in volume 18 of the evidence volumes, the Warren Commission had reproduced a long sequence of still images from the later part of the Zapruder film, the part that showed Kennedy and Connolly getting shot. The sequence ran from frame 171 to frame 374. But eagle-eyed conspiracy theorists like Lane had noticed that 4 frames were missing from this published sequence, frames 208 to 211. These frames represented less than a quarter of a second of action, and they came from the part of the film where you couldn't even see President Kennedy's limousine because it was obscured by the Stemmons freeway sign. For about 20 frames, or 1 second of action, his limo disappears behind the sign, and all you can really see is the back of the sign. That was the part of the film that frames 208 to 211 were missing from, which meant that it was pretty obvious to anybody with a pair of eyes that the missing frames couldn't possibly have contained any useful information about the assassination, which in turn made it fairly clear that whatever the reason for their absence was, it couldn't have been anything sinister. Mark Lane obviously would have known that. He wasn't a cretin, he was just a liar. So when he accusingly fired this question about the missing frames at Wesley Liebler, he would have been well aware that it was a question without significance. It was just a pseudo question. Its only purpose was to make up the numbers in Lane's gish gallop. So how should Wesley Liebler have responded to Mark Lane's gish galloping? I think the best way to respond to this kind of debating tactic is to point out on the spot that it is just a tactic. I think Liebler should have said, "Slow down, dickhead. You're deliberately asking me way more questions than I can answer, and the fact that you're doing this suggests that you know you don't have a case and you don't want this audience to hear a sensible discussion of the facts." Wesley Liebler didn't say that, unfortunately. Instead, he took an old-fashioned approach. He behaved as if Lane was asking his questions in good faith, and he tried to answer as many of those questions as he could in the 9 minutes he had available to him. He didn't have time to chase down all of the frogs that had hopped out of Lane's mouth, but he could go after at least one or two of them, and one of the frogs that Liebler tried to chase down and squash was Lane's question about the missing Zapruder frames, because Liebler happened to know exactly what the true answer to that question was. Unfortunately, this true answer was quite complicated, as true answers always tend to be. So, to get the answer on the record, Liebler had to talk unnaturally fast, almost at double speed.
You want us to know where the missing Zapruder frames are. There are 4 missing Zapruder frames, and everybody is all concerned about that, and there's no question about that we should be. What happened was, when Mr. Zapruder, who took the motion pictures of the parade, discovered that he had the motorcade in his film, he went with the Secret Service and they developed the original. They made 3 copies right then and there. So now we've got in existence 1 original and 3 copies. Life magazine bought the original and kept 1 of the copies. 2 copies were returned to the Secret Service. 1 of them was given to the FBI. When the Commission started its investigation, we used the FBI copy to do our investigation or analysis of the Zapruder film. After that, we had Life bring down the original and examined the original. And then we asked Life to make blow-ups, 4x6 blow-ups, so that we could examine them in detail. During the time, between the time that Life brought the original film down and the time that they made the blow-ups, and I know I'm going to get a laugh when I tell you this because it's absolutely unbelievable, Life magazine, who paid almost $500,000 for this picture, for this roll of film, was working with the original in our laboratory, and some guy dropped it on the floor, reached to grab it, and he crushed those 4 frames, and they cut them out.
Already, it was starting to sound as if Liebler had made a mistake and fallen into a kind of trap by trying to answer Mark Lane's bad faith question in a good faith way. "I know I'm going to get a laugh when I tell you this," Liebler said, and he was dead right. The audience laughed right on cue, even though, as we're going to see, the story that Liebler was telling them was 100% true. Thanks to the efforts of Mark Lane and other people like him, that room at UCLA had been turned into a place where telling the simple truth about any aspect of the assassination had become hard and perhaps even impossible. And all those people in the room who claimed to be so interested in hearing the truth about the assassination were in practice incapable of hearing the truth when it was explained to them. Instead, they thought that the clever thing to do was to cynically laugh at the only man in the room who both knew the truth and wanted to tell it. And this atmosphere of unreasonable doubt went well beyond that room at UCLA. Out in the wider world too, the fog of confusion surrounding the assassination was so thick that rational explanations could no longer cut through it, and the truth was ceasing to be audible. But back at UCLA, Wesley Liebler soldiered on through the laughter, and he kept trying to supply the answer that Mark Lane and the audience claimed to be so eager to hear.
Now I know you laugh, but I put it to you bluntly. I've talked about this to the editors of Life magazine time and time again, and I have said to them, since you have such an interest in the work of the Commission, and since you published Governor Connolly's speculations about this, and some of the Zapruder films, why don't you have the moral courage to tell the American people in your editorial column that you broke the film and lost those 4 frames? Well, they haven't done it yet, but I suggest that someday they're going to get their nerve up and they're going to do it. And I'm perfectly willing to stake my whole case on that one fact, and you can check it out any way you want to, but it's a fact.
Liebler didn't really sound like a man who was winning a debate there, and yet the story that he was vainly trying to tell the audience was absolutely true. Just 5 days after this debate at UCLA, Liebler was completely vindicated on this point, because in late January, somebody at Life magazine did have the moral courage to come forward and admit that an employee of the magazine had dropped the film and damaged the frames. On January the 30th, 1967, Life's managing editor released a statement that said, "It is a fact that in handling the Zapruder film, we accidentally damaged not 4, but 6 frames of the original, frames 207 through 212. Wesley Liebler had been laughed at when he tried to explain all that to the students at UCLA, but Mark Lane was the guy that they really should have been heckling and jeering, because Lane was the one pulling the wool over their eyes, and Liebler was the one who was trying to cut through all the bullshit. Unfortunately, Liebler's position was far less politically trendy than Lane's. Lane's anti-government shtick was far more up the students' alley. They liked the look of the wool that he was pulling over their eyes. So Liebler was the one they were jeering at like he was a pantomime villain. It happened again when he tried to point out, again correctly, that none of the physical evidence suggested that Kennedy had been shot from the grassy knoll, and all of it suggested that he'd been shot from the 6th floor of the Texas Schoolbook Depository.
No one seriously contends that no shots were fired from behind the motorcade, and the evidence of this is overwhelming and should be compared with the evidence that the critics set forth to suggest that shots were fired from the grassy knoll. There were 6 eyewitnesses that saw something in the window at the time the shots were fired. 2 of them actually saw the shots fired. 2 others saw the rifle. 2 others saw profile and movement that they immediately associated with the firing of the shots. I know of no such evidence with respect to the grassy knoll or anywhere else. There were 3 people on the 5th floor of the building. They were directly under the assassination window. They heard the shots, and they even heard the shell casings hit the floor, because as a matter of fact, the floor was under construction at that time. It had been torn up, and there were strips, holes you could see right through the floor. They testified that the whole building shook when the shots were fired. A rifle and 3 shell casings were found on the 6th floor.
Again, Liebler was getting a big laugh for saying something that was 100% true. One of the witnesses who had been sitting in the 5th floor corner window of the book depository, a guy named Bonnie Ray Williams, did indeed testify to the Warren Commission that the whole building seemed to shake when the shots were fired. Williams testified, quote, "The second shot, it sounded like it was right in the building. The second and third shot, it even shook the building, the side we were sitting on. Cement fell on my head. Cement, gravel, dirt or something from the old building, because it shook the windows and everything. Harold was sitting next to me, and he said it came right from over our head. If you want to know my exact words, I could tell you. My exact words were, no bullshit." But at UCLA, when Liebler accurately quoted Williams' claim that he'd felt the building shake when the shots rang out, Liebler was laughed at. Apparently the audience either thought that he was making this claim up out of thin air, or else they lacked the imagination to see that a witness might well have felt that the building around him was shaking if he'd had the misfortune to be innocently sitting in a window watching a parade when some psychotic prick with a high-powered rifle suddenly started firing shots from the window straight above his head. Either way, the point, once more, is that by early 1967 the truth about the Kennedy assassination could still be told, but it could no longer really be heard. the people like Mark Lane had effectively won the battle of ideas. The truth was starting to sound like a lie, and lies were starting to sound like the truth. Unreasonable doubt was winning. This was a sinister achievement on the part of people like Lane, and unfortunately it's never entirely been undone. The atmosphere of confusion around the assassination still lingers. If you doubt that, just take a look at the comments section under any YouTube video that features Mark Lane. You'll see comments like, "Thank you, Mark Lane, for your tremendous service to the American people," and "I would ride into any anti-fascist battle with Mark Lane. R.I.P. Mr. Lane." I find it quite hilarious that anybody would call Mark Lane an anti-fascist. If anybody was behaving like a fascist during that debate at UCLA, it was Mark Lane. Fascists don't tell the truth, and they don't want other people to hear it or know it. They use their rhetorical powers to shout down and drown out the truth. They urge people to forget about reason and evidence and to believe the things that make them feel good. That's exactly what Lane was doing in that hall. The fact that he branded himself as a progressive is totally irrelevant unless you think that it's somehow progressive to create an atmosphere in which the truth can no longer be heard. So what has all this got to do with Donald Trump? I'd say it's got a lot to do with him. For one thing, it gets us back to what I said at the beginning of this episode about how Trump's conspiracy theories put him well beyond the pale of normal left versus right politics. Trump brands himself as a Republican and an anti-leftist, whereas Mark Lane branded himself as a radical and an anti-fascist. But when you peel away their political self-descriptions, you find that these two chronic truth-dodging charlatans have got an awful amount in common. Like Lane, Trump goes around spouting absurd conspiracy theories that happen to align with his personal interests. Like Lane, Trump has a decidedly fascistic rhetorical style. Like Lane, Trump enjoys a good gish gallop. Listen to him using the technique here.
Well, I don't think too many believe that. And let me tell you about January 6th. On January 6th, we had a great border. Nobody coming through, very few. On January 6th, we were energy independent. On January 6th, we had the lowest taxes ever. We had the lowest regulations ever. On January 6th, we were respected all over the world. All over the world, we were respected. And then he comes in, and we're now laughed at. We're like a bunch of stupid people.
In the space of about 30 seconds, Trump makes something like 9 different off-the-cuff assertions there. That's 9 frogs that have come leaping out of Trump's mouth and gone hopping off in all directions. As it happens, I can personally squash one of those frogs, namely the claim that America was respected all around the world when Trump was president. But beyond saying that, I wouldn't waste my time trying to refute any of what Trump said there, because I wouldn't want to fall into the trap of taking Trump's verbal output more seriously than he takes it himself. In the clip that I just played, Trump was mainly just freestyling and saying anything that happened to pop into his head at that particular moment, without worrying for a millisecond if what he was saying was objectively true, assuming that the concept of objective truth even exists inside his head. If you had asked Trump 30 seconds later to repeat everything that he just said, I'd be surprised if he could have remembered even half of it. In that respect, Trump is not like Dwayne Gish or Mark Lane. Lane and Gish were crafty, calculating debaters who knew exactly what they were doing when they filled the air with their barrages of bullshit. Trump fills the air with barrages of bullshit too, but while Lane and Gish did that quite consciously and deliberately, Trump seems to do it purely by instinct. It's just his style. It's been pointed out by some commentators, for example by Sam Harris, that Trump is too lazy to be a liar in the classic sense because lying is quite hard to do mentally. Liars have to carry what's called a cognitive load. They have to know what the truth is, and they have to make a conscious effort to avoid telling it. Mark Lane was certainly a liar in that classic sense, but Trump is just a guy who doesn't know or care about the truth and just says the first thing that pops into his head. But although Trump seems to do this instinctively, he does have mentors and handlers who are more like Mark Lane and have a clear intellectual grasp of how Trump's brand of bullshit works at the tactical level. When Steve Bannon was working as Trump's chief White House counsel, he had an eloquent name for Trump's verbal style. He called it flooding the zone, or more specifically, he called it flooding the zone with shit. Bannon told a reporter in 2018, "The Democrats don't matter. The real opposition is the media, and the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with shit." Steve Bannon, of course, said this in a spirit of approval. To people like him, flooding the zone with shit is desirable, and destroying the norms of civilization is a good thing. This attitude of Bannon's is quite hard for a normal person to understand. It sounds almost as if Bannon is an incredibly horrible human being who is proudly confessing to being an incredibly horrible human being. And in fact, that is exactly what Bannon was doing. And if you can get your head around that, you've come pretty close to understanding the essence of Trumpism. Flooding the zone with shit is very similar to gish galloping, but the two techniques are not quite identical. To give Dwayne Gish a bit of credit, he never openly admitted that he was flooding the zone with shit. In fact, not even Mark Lane did that. Also, the zone that Gish wanted to flood with his gibberish was relatively small. It was just the particular debating hall that he happened to be standing in at a given moment. With Donald Trump, the zone being flooded and degraded is an entire country. A Trump supporter would no doubt reply that all politicians lie, so what's so new and different about Trump? Kamala Harris tells a lot of lies too, so what makes Trump so much worse than her? That Trump supporter wouldn't be entirely wrong. Kamala Harris does indeed seem to have a hard time telling the truth. But to give Harris some credit, she does at least know what the truth is when she isn't telling it. She's not looking to eradicate the whole concept of truth. She's not looking to drive truth itself out of existence. She's just an old-fashioned liar and hypocrite. There's a quote I like from the French writer La Rochefoucauld, who said that hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. In other words, people who are hypocrites may not be virtuous, but they do at least know that there is such a thing as virtue, and they do have the minimal decency to at least try to look virtuous. Kamala Harris does at least try to do that. She may lie a lot, but she was at least raised well enough to know that telling the truth is the right thing to do, and she at least has the decency to squirm and look embarrassed when she's avoiding the truth. Trump, of course, never looks embarrassed. This is a radical development in American politics, and flooding the zone with shit is something completely new and different from the run-of-the-mill lying that all politicians have always engaged in. To put it another way, the shit part isn't very new. It's the flooding part that we need to focus on if we want to understand what's so novel about Trump's approach. The endless torrent of verbal garbage that spews out of his mouth is designed, consciously or unconsciously, to drown out and overwhelm people's sense that there's such a thing as the objective truth that exists independently of what Trump or anyone else thinks is true. When Trump debated Kamala Harris earlier this year, there was some talk of the network doing some real-time fact-checking, but when a person ignores the truth as chronically as Trump does, fact-checking him in real time is physically impossible. It's like trying to bail out the Titanic by hand with a bucket. When Trump speaks, the truth gets buried, not just the particular truth that he wants to avoid telling at that particular moment, but truth in general. The whole idea that there's a big difference between what's true and what isn't. If the concept of objective truth vanished from the world, you don't get the sense that Donald Trump would mind. After all, the concept doesn't exist in his head, so why should it exist in the world beyond? This is surely one of Trump's main aims in life. He wants to drag everybody else down to his mental level, the level where you don't need to read books or newspapers or listen to other people to work out what the truth is. You just say what you feel the truth is, and your version of the truth is going to be at least as good as anybody else's. So this deep down assault on the whole value of truth is something very different from lying in the classic sense. To underline this point a little more, I want to talk about Russian propaganda for a minute. This might seem like a radical change of topic, but if you bear with me, I think you'll see that it's an extension of the same topic. Vladimir Putin is a master of flooding the zone. In his hands, the way Russia uses propaganda is fundamentally different from the way that the Soviets used propaganda during the Cold War. In those days, the propaganda that the Kremlin pumped out was very crude and predictable and one-dimensional. It was designed to push out one simple false narrative. The Soviet Union was good and the West was decadent and wicked. Soviet communism was working and it represented the future of humankind. To spread this false narrative, the Soviet propagandists had to do a lot of old-fashioned lying. They staged show trials where people confessed to crimes that they hadn't really committed. They covered up statistics about famines and murders. They brought over delegations of credulous foreign visitors and they gave them tours of little Potemkin villages where the workers' paradise seemed to be flourishing. All that was pretty straightforward and easy to decode. But these days, the Kremlin of Vladimir Putin uses propaganda in a far more sophisticated postmodern way. It uses the internet and state-controlled media to pump out a blizzard of conflicting and contradictory false narratives so that the truth will be drowned out in a torrent of noise. The old-school Kremlin propagandists pushed one simple narrative that was the opposite of the truth, whereas new-school Putin propagandists flood the zone with a multitude of different untrue narratives, and they don't care which of those narratives people will accept as long as they've been left too snowblind to see the truth. The goal now isn't simply to deceive people, it's to bewilder them, and to bewilder them at such a deep level that they will eventually give up on the idea that the truth can ever really be known. A good example of the modern Russian propaganda machine in action came in 2014 when Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 was shot down over the Ukraine. All 298 people on board that flight died, 283 passengers and 15 crew. The truth about this disaster was that it was Russia's fault. Russia was invading parts of eastern Ukraine at the time, and a Russian-backed military unit operating inside Ukraine shot down the Malaysian Airlines flight by accident, thinking that it was a Ukrainian military plane. To cover this fact up, Russia's state-controlled TV channels immediately started pumping out a blizzard of fake news stories about the incident. They reported that the plane was a Ukrainian transport plane rather than a passenger plane. Some reports said that it was a Ukrainian military aircraft. Other reports acknowledged that it was a passenger aircraft, but said that it had actually been shot down by the Ukrainians, either from the ground or from the air. One Russian official claimed that the bodies found in the wreckage of MH17 were not fresh, which suggested that the CIA must have collected a bunch of corpses, loaded them onto the plane, and then flown this plane full of corpses over the war zone as some kind of false flag provocation. Any person who had been following all these reports at the time would have understood that they couldn't all have been true. If the aircraft was indeed a passenger plane full of corpses, then it wasn't a transport plane. If the Ukrainians shot the plane down from the air, they couldn't have also shot it down from the ground. There was no version of reality in which all the things reported by Russia's state media could actually have happened. There was no version of reality in which even half of them could have happened. But that's the point of this style of propaganda. It's designed to erode and degrade people's sense of what's real and what can be known. This propaganda technique is so common in Russia that, again, a special name has been coined for it. Propaganda experts call it the fire hose of falsehood approach. The historian Timothy Snyder has written that this kind of Russian propaganda amounts to, quote, a calculated effort to undo logic and factuality. In other words, it wants to change the way people's brains work. It wants us to forget that when something happens in the world, like a plane crash or a presidential assassination, what happened is a fact, and it's possible to work out accurately what happened as long as we remember certain basic logical laws, like the law that the simplest explanation is generally the best, and that one thing happened and one thing only, and that two things cannot have happened at once. And it isn't just the Russian people that Vladimir Putin wants to bewilder with his fire hose of falsehood. He also uses the internet to aim the fire hose at the rest of the world. Putin wants people in the West to give up on the idea of truth too, the way a large portion of the Russian population already has. Just as Donald Trump would rather drag people down to his mental level than improve himself, Putin doesn't want to bring Russia up to the West's level by liberalising it and democratising it. He would rather drag the West down to Russia's level of paranoid ignorance by flooding the internet with Russian propaganda. Until quite recently, there was a building in St. Petersburg called the Internet Research Agency, which is operated by Russian military intelligence. This building was full of professional trolls whose job it was to flood Twitter and Facebook and the internet with false claims and conspiracy theories. In the run-up to the presidential election in 2016, these trolls were instrumental in flooding the internet with anti-Hillary Clinton conspiracy theories. Another conduit of Russian propaganda is RT, Russia's international TV channel. I want to quote something that the philosopher Jason Stanley has written about RT. Stanley points out that on RT you can hear from a surprisingly wide variety of political voices, from neo-Nazis to far leftists. But this apparent diversity of viewpoints is a trick. It's a way of messing with viewers' minds. Stanley writes, quote, "In devising the strategy for RT, Russian propagandists realised that with a cacophony of opinions and outlandish possibilities, one could undermine the basic background set of presuppositions about the world that allows for productive inquiry. RT's strategy was not devised to produce knowledge, it was rather devised as a propaganda technique to undermine trust in basic democratic institutions. Objective truth is drowned out in the resulting cacophony of voices. The effect of RT, as well as the myriad conspiracy theory producing websites across the world, including in the United States, has been to destabilise the kind of shared reality that is in fact required for democratic contestation." End quote. Old-school Russian propaganda seems almost quaint when you compare it with this new approach. The old school propaganda just told one simple story that was the opposite of the objective truth. The new stuff is designed to choke out the very possibility of objective truth. It wants people to think that everybody lies all the time, including the media, and no story is better than any other. So you might as well just believe what Putin says, because at least he's a strong guy who seems to know what's good for Russia. That last part is the paradox of the kind of relativism that people like Putin and Trump practice. On the one hand, these men want their populations to give up on the idea that the truth can ever really be known, but in their capacity as strong men, they also want people to believe that there is such a thing as the truth after all, and that if you only listen to what they say, you will know what the truth is. Trump, for example, has spent countless hours sowing doubt about the legitimacy of the 2020 election. He wants us to ask ourselves how we can trust the word of a bunch of faceless election officials who might be crooked and who might be working in the interests of the deep state. He wants us to ask ourselves how we can ever really know for sure what the true result of any election is. And yet at the same time, he claims to know for sure what the result of that election was. He won it by a landslide, and it was stolen from him. When it comes to his own views, Trump suddenly becomes a big fan of the concept of objective truth. And after all, this is a man who named his social media platform Truth Social. Trump wants us to think in this instance that the truth is knowable, and he knows it, and he wants people to behave as if his assertions are 100% true. On January the 6th, people did behave as if Trump's big lie about the election was true, and some of them died in the name of that fiction, to say nothing of the innocent people who died while trying to protect the Capitol from the people who believed Trump. Again, I don't claim to be saying anything very new when I point to the parallels between Trump's instinctive flooding the zone approach and Vladimir Putin's more systematic fire hose of falsehood approach. All this has been said before by writers like Timothy Snyder and Anne Applebaum and Jason Stanley. Again, if I am saying anything new here, it's about the links between these propaganda techniques and Kennedy conspiracy theory. The early Kennedy conspiracists were flooding the zone about Kennedy's assassination way back when Trump and Putin were still heinous little teenagers. As I've been saying since the very first episode of the podcast, there's nothing complicated or mysterious about the true story of Kennedy's assassination. The truth is very simple and fully knowable. The problem is that it's been drowned out almost since day one by the smog and smoke of conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theorists hate and fear the official story about the Kennedy assassination, which is otherwise known as the truth, and they've never managed to replace that truth with a coherent alternative story of their own, but they have managed to bury it under a Putin-esque cacophony of mutually contradictory stories. The CIA did it, the FBI did it, the mob did it, the Corsicans did it, David Ferry did it, Clay Shaw did it, the anti-Castro Cubans did it, the pro-Castro Cubans did it. None of these stories has ever stood up on its own 2 feet by itself, but together, as they've piled up over the years, the net effect of these stories has been to create the general impression that something fishy happened in Dallas, and the truth about it has never been known and perhaps never will be known. As long as we're on the topic of propaganda and big lies, I'm going to need to talk briefly about Adolf Hitler. I'm not about to say that Trump is exactly the same as Hitler. If you think I'm going to say that, you can relax. What I am about to say is that it's simply undeniable that Trump's use of the big lie comes straight out of Adolf Hitler's playbook. Hitler outlined his thoughts about the big lie in Mein Kampf, which he wrote in prison 8 years before coming to power in Germany. He wrote, "In the big lie, there is always a certain force of credibility. the broad masses are more likely to fall victim to the big lie than the small lie, Hitler wrote, because small lies are more familiar to us. We all tell small lies in the course of our everyday lives, which means that we know how small lies work, and we're therefore always alert to the possibility that other people are going to tell small lies to us. But most of us don't go around telling big lies in our everyday lives because we know that big lies are relatively easy to prove false. And because the broad masses don't go around telling big lies themselves, they tend to assume that other people won't tell them either, which means that they're more likely to fall for the big lie when they hear it. As Hitler put it, it would never come into their heads to fabricate colossal untruths, and they would not believe that others could have the impudence to distort the truth so infamously. When Hitler wrote about the big lie in Mein Kampf, he wasn't openly recommending it as a tactic. He wasn't saying, if I ever come to power in Germany, I'm going to fool the masses with lots of big lies of my own. What he was saying was that the big lie was a wicked tactic invented by the world's Jews. According to him, the Jews had sabotaged the German war effort in World War I and had then spread the big lie that Germany lost the war because it had been outfought by the other side. This claim of Hitler's was, of course, not true. It was a paranoid fiction. It was a big lie in itself. And when Hitler told it, he was giving himself a license to tell more big lies about the Jews in future, if he ever had the chance to do that on a big stage. After all, if the Jews had invented this tactic of the big lie, it was only fair to retaliate by using the big lie against them. This type of reasoning will seem very familiar to anybody who's read a lot of conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theorists often think this way. They think that the other side behaved unethically when it was inventing the official story, and that makes it only fair to behave a bit unethically themselves when they're attacking the official story. I call this move the charlatan's two-step. It's a move that's rife in Kennedy conspiracy theory. The conspiratorial books, even the very best of them, are full of corner-cutting and cherry-picking of the evidence, which the authors seem to think is only fair because they believe that the Warren Commission did a lot of cherry-picking and corner-cutting in its own right. Oliver Stone summed up this line of reasoning when he said, "Who owns reality? He who makes it up so that most everyone believes it. That person wins." There are two things wrong with that line of reasoning. One of them is ethical. Obviously, if the other side did distort the truth, that doesn't make it okay for you to distort the truth too. But the bigger problem with the charlatan's two-step is that it's based on a false premise. In the Kennedy case, the Warren Commission did not, in fact, systematically distort the truth in its report. If it had, there would have been no need for the critics to give themselves permission to cut corners when making their own case. They could have simply told the old-fashioned truth and pointed in detail to the specific lies that the Warren Commission was supposed to have told. Donald Trump performed his own version of the charlatan's two-step in January 2021 when he was trying to convince Mike Pence not to certify the results of the 2020 election. According to Pence's notes of their conversation, which have just been released, Trump told him, "When there's fraud, the rules get changed. You can be bold. You have the right to do whatever you want to do." Again, before you even get to what's morally wrong with that syllogism, you need to recognise that the premise of it is just not factually correct. The 2020 election was not a fraud. The belief that it was simply a fantasy or a delusion of Trump's. In reality, the other side hadn't changed the rules or behaved boldly and illegally. The only person doing that was Trump. His unethical behaviour was all too real, but the unethical behaviour of the other side was purely imaginary. And this is always the way when conspiracy theorists perform the charlatan's two-step. Thankfully, Mike Pence was sane enough to know this and to refuse to buy in to Trump's version of reality. How sane Trump is another question, which I can't pretend to know the answer to. With conniving and fully sane charlatans like Mark Lane and Vladimir Putin and Steve Bannon, it's fairly easy to understand what goes on in their heads. Trump is a harder man to get a handle on. A closer analogy with Trump would probably be Jim Garrison. When I was talking about Garrison, I always found it hard to gauge the extent to which he was consciously lying and the extent to which he was sincerely deluded. I also pointed out in the case of Garrison that those two things are not mutually exclusive and that a deluded person can also be a liar. Garrison showed us that a story that starts off its life as a conscious lie can turn into a sincerely held delusion if you repeat the lie to yourself often enough. Garrison, on the basis of no evidence at all, kept repeating the claim that David Ferrie and Clay Shaw and the CIA had all been involved in the Kennedy assassination, and Garrison repeated this claim so often that it seems that at some level he did come to genuinely believe that it was true. Donald Trump has repeatedly claimed that more than 1 million people attended his first inauguration and that the 2020 election was stolen from him. And it wouldn't surprise me if Trump has by now repeated these big lies so often that at some level he does believe that they're true. And by the way, I would say here to any Trump fans who are still listening that if you find it offensive or boring when people compare Trump to Hitler, then maybe he should stop behaving the way Hitler did, and maybe he should stop telling big, unbelievable, ridiculous lies that are clearly untrue, and maybe you should stop believing in them and encouraging him to tell even bigger lies. Trump's big lie about the 2020 election takes us back to the rule that it's much easier to tell a big lie than it is to refute a big lie. It takes about 2 seconds to say that the 2020 election was stolen, but to prove that the election wasn't stolen takes a very, very long time. But as it happens, there is one easy, shortcut way of demonstrating that Trump's stolen election lie was indeed a lie. All you have to do is remember that before Trump told this lie in 2020, he had told exactly the same lie twice before, preemptively, in advance of 2 earlier elections. And on both those occasions, Trump had won those elections, which means that reality had proved that his preemptive lie about the big steal was just making shit up. The Stop the Steal slogan that became famous in 2020 had actually been invented back in 2016 by Trump's political fixer Roger Stone. Stone first used the Stop the Steal slogan ahead of the 2016 Republican primaries. At that stage, the claim was that the Republican nomination was about to get stolen from Trump by a sinister coalition of Republicans consisting of Jeb Bush, Mitt Romney, Ted Cruz, and basically all the other Republican candidates except Trump. But that, of course, didn't end up happening. Trump ended up winning the Republican nomination, and the idea that the primary was going to get stolen from him was refuted. So Roger Stone then rebooted the Stop the Steal idea ahead of the 2016 general election. He launched a Stop the Steal website and he started soliciting for funds. If this election is close, they will steal it, Stone proclaimed on that website. But again, this conspiratorial claim was completely falsified by what happened next. The election was close, but they didn't steal it from Trump. Instead, for some reason, they let Trump win and they let him serve 4 full years in office. So then, ahead of the 2020 general election, Roger Stone rebooted the Stop the Steal slogan yet again, and this time Trump finally did lose the election. and the Stop the Steal campaign went into overdrive, and we all know what happened next. I want to finish this episode of the podcast by talking a bit more about Roger Stone, because in the figure of Roger Stone, all the threads of the story that I've been telling in this episode come together. Stone brings together the themes of Donald Trump and Russian propaganda and conspiracy theory and flooding the zone and big lies and grotesque personal immorality. Stone even wrote an incredibly shonky book about the Kennedy assassination, which I'll talk about in a moment. But before he wrote that book, Stone did something even more unconscionable. He apparently was the man who first suggested to Donald Trump back in 1998 that he should think seriously about making a run for the American presidency. When Trump did successfully run in 2016, Stone worked as an advisor to his campaign, first in an official capacity and then in an unofficial one. Stone is like the Mark Lane of Trumpism, but Stone has a kind of 21st century chutzpah that not even Mark Lane had. Lane was a dirty trickster, but he didn't openly admit that he was a dirty trickster. Roger Stone, on the other hand, does call himself a dirty trickster. Like Trump, Roger Stone is a hard man to embarrass. Back in the 1970s, he worked in the Nixon administration, and unlike almost everybody else who worked for Nixon, Roger Stone remained a Nixon apologist to the extent that he had a giant tattoo of Nixon's face put on his back. So how does Roger Stone connect to the Russian part of this story? Well, let's go back to March 2016, when somebody hacked the email account of John Podesta, the chairman of Hillary Clinton's election campaign. They sent him a so-called spear phishing email inviting him to change his Gmail password, and when Podesta did that, his email account was hacked and around 50,000 emails were stolen from it. It turned out later that the culprits were Russian hackers working for Russian military intelligence. Later that year, a hacker who called himself Guccifer 2.0 offered the stolen Podesta emails to WikiLeaks, along with another tranche of emails that had been stolen from the offices of the DNC itself. Guccifer 2.0 claimed to be a lone Romanian hacker, but in fact, he was not a real person. He was a composite character who had been created by Russian military intelligence. In July 2016, just ahead of the Democratic National Convention, WikiLeaks started publishing the hacked DNC emails. The contents of those emails were very embarrassing to Hillary Clinton's campaign, but as yet, the WikiLeaks did not drop the stolen Podesta emails. In August, 2 weeks after the Democratic Convention, Guccifer 2.0 reached out to Roger Stone via Twitter, and the two of them started exchanging direct messages. In August, Stone tweeted that Guccifer was, quote, a hero. Also in August, Stone told a gathering of Republicans that he was personally in touch with Julian Assange of WikiLeaks and that more leaks were on the way which were going to torpedo Hillary Clinton's campaign. Whether Roger Stone really was in touch with Julian Assange is a matter of debate because Assange has denied that. But what was certainly true was that Stone was in touch with WikiLeaks via a back channel. Later in August, Stone tweeted publicly, "Trust me, it will soon be Podesta's time in the barrel." Stone also started confidently telling people that an October surprise was on the way, which would finally sink Hillary Clinton's campaign for good. In early October, Stone tweeted things like, "Hillary Clinton is done," and "Julian Assange will deliver a devastating expose on Hillary Clinton at a time of his choosing. I stand by my prediction." Via his back channel to WikiLeaks, Stone started offering the organisation some free advice on when the best time would be to drop the Podesta emails. That optimum time finally came on the afternoon of October the 7th, 2016. At 4:03 p.m. that afternoon, something happened that seemed to spell doom for Donald Trump's campaign. The Washington Post published the so-called Pussygate tape, also known as the Access Hollywood tape, the one where Trump had been caught on tape bragging to Billy Bush about grabbing women by the pussy. In a sane world, that would have been the end for Donald Trump. But just minutes after the Pussygate tape appeared, Roger Stone sent an urgent text to his WikiLeaks back channel. Stone's text said, quote, "Drop the Podesta emails immediately." And Stone very quickly got his wish. At 4:32 that afternoon, just 29 minutes after the appearance of the Pussygate tape, WikiLeaks dropped the first batch of Podesta emails, around 6,000 of them. And of course, as a result, the news about Pussygate was at least partly drowned out by the news about the dumping of the Podesta emails. So Hillary Clinton's campaign was being systematically undermined and attacked by an unholy alliance of beyond-the-pale characters who not only didn't want Hillary Clinton to win the election, but more broadly wanted to take American democracy down a few pegs. On the extreme right, you had Stone and Trump. On the extreme left, you had Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And then you had Vladimir Putin, who is a bit harder to place on the left-right political spectrum. As a result of the Mueller inquiry, all of these facts about the hacking of the 2016 election were later unearthed, and indictments were issued against Roger Stone, as well as 12 of the Russian intelligence agents who had hacked Podesta's emails. In 2020, Roger Stone was sentenced to 40 months in prison for 7 felonies, including witness tampering and lying to Congress. For a brief moment, it looked as if somebody in this story was finally going to get punished for their crimes against American democracy, but before Stone could serve a day of his sentence, Donald Trump intervened and commuted it. Roger Stone repaid this favour later on by reviving the Stop the Steal idea ahead of the 2020 election. This time around, of course, Trump finally did lose the election, so everybody got to see what this Stop the Steal idea looked like when it was put into practice. And there's no doubt that Roger Stone did seem to want the chaos that ended up happening. Just a day before the 2020 election, Stone was caught on camera saying, quote, "Fuck the voting, let's get right to the violence." The violence was indeed got to in due course, and although naturally enough Roger Stone himself was not present when it happened and when people started dying. So what about that book that I mentioned that Roger Stone wrote about the JFK assassination? He published it in 2013, and it was called The Man Who Killed Kennedy, and it had a big mugshot on the front cover of Lyndon Johnson, because according to Roger Stone, the man who killed Kennedy, or who at least ordered and organised his murder, was President Lyndon Johnson. Roger Stone's book became a New York Times bestseller, and it was also a contemptible piece of garbage, and I can sum up its moral and factual worth by quoting just a single sentence from it. The sentence is about the bullet that was found on Governor Connolly's stretcher after the assassination, and here's what Roger Stone said about that bullet. Quote, "The problem with the projectile found is that it was completely intact without a mark on it." End quote. It's hard to say anything new in the field of Kennedy conspiracy theory because pretty much everything has already been said before, but when Roger Stone wrote that sentence about the stretcher bullet, he did make a kind of breakthrough. No previous Kennedy conspiracy theorist had ever used the tactic of the big lie so blatantly. Previous conspiracy theorists had made some outlandish arguments about the stretcher bullet, but they had at least based their arguments on observable reality. Photographs of the stretcher bullet exist and they can be easily looked at, and they show that the base of the bullet is very mangled and squashed. Nobody before Roger Stone had ever seriously contended that the bullet was completely undamaged. The standard conspiratorial claim was that it just wasn't damaged enough to have inflicted all the injuries that it supposedly inflicted on Kennedy and Connolly. But here you had Roger Stone in cold print saying that the bullet was completely intact without a mark on it. This was the very definition of a big lie, the lie so large and so easy to falsify that you just can't believe that anybody would have the impudence to tell it. Or maybe Stone wasn't lying when he wrote that sentence. Maybe he just hadn't bothered to acquaint himself with the basic facts about the case that he presumed to be such an expert on. It's hard to tell because by the time Stone wrote his book about the assassination, Kennedy conspiracy theory had fallen into a kind of decadence. It was nothing more than a heap of dead cliches, and the finer points of the evidence had been so generally forgotten that it was possible for a charlatan like Roger Stone to come along and try to pin the crime on President Lyndon Johnson without even managing to be accurate about the single most famous piece of physical evidence in the whole case. There was a documentary made about Roger Stone in the run-up to the 2020 election and the events of January the 6th, 2021. Stone was rash enough to let a Danish documentary crew follow him around during this period, and the film they made about him was called A Storm Foretold. These were the filmmakers who had caught Stone saying on tape a day before the election, "Fuck the voting, let's get right to the violence." The film also shows Stone hanging around with members of the Proud Boys and gleefully stoking the fires of the Stop the Steal campaign. You see him checking into a Washington hotel on the eve of January the 6th on the assumption that he'll be getting an official invite to share the stage with Donald Trump the next afternoon, and he'll get to deliver a speech of his own. On the morning of the 6th, it slowly dawns on Stone that his VIP invitation has been withdrawn. His suspicions are confirmed when he sees Rudy Giuliani getting picked up by a White House car out the front of the hotel, and there's no equivalent car for Stone, which makes it quite clear that he won't be going. So Stone throws a tantrum and he watches the action on TV in his hotel room instead. When people start dying on camera, Stone hastily starts packing his bags so he can flee Washington before the arrests begin. "I am getting out of town," he says. And when he's safely out of Washington, you see Stone writing a letter to Trump requesting a second pardon, a preemptive blanket pardon that will get him out of any prosecutions that might arise as a result of the Capitol riot. But it soon becomes clear that Donald Trump does not intend to give Stone this second pardon. On Trump's final day in office, when it becomes absolutely clear that Roger Stone won't be getting his pardon, Stone has a meltdown on camera and he begins to say exactly what he really thinks about Trump. He needs to be impeached, he says. He needs to be denounced. He's the greatest single mistake in American history. He's a cocksucker who surrounded himself with morons. Fuck him and his abortionist bitch daughter, Stone says. I'm recording this podcast a week before the 2024 presidential election. I don't know what's going to happen next Tuesday, but then again, there are a lot of things I don't know. I'm not even sure what I want to happen next Tuesday. I don't want Trump to win, obviously, but I also find it hard to hope that he will lose, because if he loses, it's almost certain that there will be some kind of violence. Either way, the election promises to deliver something horrible. Another thing I don't know, or anyway, I don't fully understand, is why America seems to have gotten into the business of rewarding bad people instead of punishing them. If America really is interested in making itself great again, it does have to stop doing this. America was founded on the proposition that some truths are self-evident, but now America, or at least a good chunk of its voting population, seems to have forgotten that. It seems to have gotten into the habit of overthinking things that really shouldn't be overthought, while underthinking things that really do need to be thought about. It seems to have lost sight of the fact that some things are just true and some things are just false, and that the difference between what's true and false may be hard to work out, but it's not impossible to work out. Think about all the people I've talked about in this episode of the podcast. Mark Lane, Jim Garrison, Donald Trump, Adolf Hitler, Vladimir Putin, Steve Bannon and Roger Stone. What do all these people have in common? They're all conspiracy theorists, for one thing, but more basically, the big thing that they all have in common is that they're all terrible and defective human beings. They're not all as terrible as each other, but they are all self-evidently terrible. They're all dicks. Let's not overthink it. The fact that they're all men is also probably connected with this, given that the vast majority of history's dicks have been men. Again, we're talking about stuff that really should be self-evident to everybody. Nice people are nicer than nasty ones. And the reason nasty people are nasty is that they do nasty things. For example, if they hear that one of their work colleagues is about to get lynched and hung, they say, "So what?" The Russian people don't have a choice about having a horrible man at the helm of their country, but the American people do. Next Tuesday, we'll get to see whether America and the world will now have to live through 4 more years of not knowing what this terrible man is going to say next, or more importantly, what he's going to do next. Another self-evident thing that seems to get forgotten in the field of Trumpism and in the field of conspiracy theory is that fire is hot, and if you play with it, you're going to get burned. Or if you don't get burned, somebody else is going to. And I'll be exploring that point further next time on The Ghosts of Dallas.
Please get us the medication. It's simple, there's no convulsions with it, it's just simple, just please get it. Before it's too late, the GDF will be here. I tell you, get moving, get moving, get moving. I can do them, all they're doing is taking a drink to go to sleep. That's what death is, sleep. And I do hope that those attorneys will stay where they belong and don't come up here.